What on here, when we look at these mission-driven solutions, if we were going to add your citations, what of these could you cite? This is pretty easy because
Sure.
you just double their money.
Yeah, absolutely. One report that I've been looking at quite a bit and citing is a report that was put out by Virginia Cooperative Extension called the Snapshot Report. And it basically was a report about SNAP eligible households in Virginia and looking at their rates of food security and demographic data and other things. But that report's been really important for us because it really does point to the need for our program, because the rates among SNAP eligible households for food insecurity were alarmingly high.
Yeah.
Way higher than the national average, like 4 times as high, 5 times as high nearly.
Yeah. So you remember that things that community level data that creates a sense of urgency, that isn't so much an outcome, right? How do we know that incentive programs work? I mean, you guys are looking at it, but how do we know it works?
You mean from the perspective of VFM or the perspective of like looking at literature?
Looking at literature. Like, is this a best practice? Is there research on it? Is there something that you can say, yeah, when you actually, because what we don't have is the longer term outcome, right?
Right. So the Nutrition Incentive Hub, who are basically the people who facilitate these programs at the national level, so they're essentially our federal funder. They publish a pretty big impact report every year, and so that's really the data that I would go to first.
Yeah.
And a lot of they employ quite a few research scientists, and they also tend to publish some of that work in academic journals. And so I would look at Google Scholar to look up papers on nutrition incentive programs and fruit and vegetable intake or food security status and things like that.
So when you do this, this is probably published online. Make sure that you're finding citations that are published online and not too technical. So like if the Nutrition Incentive Hub probably has research behind it, right? Or the US Food Security Department or something like that. They've got research, or even the grant.
So the USDA Economic Research Service, they're the people who put out the food security data every year. So theirs is for the whole US population. And so I don't read too much into that, because I know that among SNAP households and SNAP eligible and like lower income, like low food access populations, the numbers are usually a lot higher. And so that's where you kind of have to go to more of that community level data.
That's exactly right. But in order to be able to say, like the USDA, they probably say, here's the national problem and we should fix it through prescription programs and matches, right? And so what are they citing to show that that's the case? So you can show the impact nationally, but what you really want is citations that show that this decreases food insecurity or increases food security and physical health, right?
And mental health too, honestly.
Actually, eating behavior may be longer term change would be quality of life. So what you want is so the steps would be access to food, right? Immediate impact is access to food and eating it, right? The longer term change is food security. And then the really longer term change is increased quality of life, right? That's sort of the argument for, and you need something that shows that, like, if somebody has followed people long term and talked to them about access to food and whether or not they're able to eat better and whether or not their kids are able then to try food because they can afford to buy it, right? Like, you know, if you're poor, you can't you can't buy food to have the kids go, yeah, I don't like squash, and not eat it. You have to be able to have them try it. Do you have any thoughts or citations on supporting a network of food system leaders? I wonder what the best practices and stuff are around that. Do you have any ideas?
So this one is really focused more on like our resources. I mean, I usually look at like impact reports and things from other like similar mission-driven organizations. So that's like some data sets that I like to look at in terms of best practices. So like I'll also connect with people who are doing the work and have them come present at one of our trainings, and sort of share real life case studies or best practices.
I wonder if there are any kind of publications that show that coordination of services like this builds capacity, builds long.
Yeah, so there's actually a journal that is dedicated just to this topic. So that is usually the journal that I will read related to food systems. It's called the Journal of Agriculture, Food Systems, and Community Development. And
Great.
instead of publishing, survey data and other like really sciencey things, they tend to publish more of like, like case study, like real life, like grounded in the work, which just makes it a really fun journal to read.
Well, and it's also because it's really hard to study this, right? Like, because you're building the coordination of services and you can see how long they last, but at some point, everything is going to change and then it's not there anymore, right? So, but what you do want is you want to see whether or not this is there's a sustainability to it. And so here you want a couple of citations, maybe from the journal, that says this is a best practice, right? We believe that this is a best practice for sustainability.
That's a great idea.
And then here with the advocacy, there aren't really any citations, like, because it's not something that's usually cited, sort of like I didn't cite the education and support for the housing, like it's just part of the way that the programming is done. So if you want state level sustainability, then the only way to do that is through advocacy, right? Is to either, start running your own politicians or to advocate to the politicians that are there. So
or anytime they put out like a report, like an example of that might be the Virginia Roadmap to End Hunger. So we constantly reference that in our advocacy efforts.
Perfect.
And during the tenure of the former governor of Virginia, he had composed something called the Children's Cabinet, which was basically focused on children's health and, other issues to enhance quality of life for kids. And so food security was one of those.
Okay. So yeah, so basically what you would put here is you would put these two citations, which are presumably available on the web, as basically as examples of how this can be driven from the advocacy level. So you would put these two citations here, you'd put a couple of citations here, and you'd put a couple of citations here. And then those would be listed on the back. And on the back, you would have either a graph or the latest data about food insecurity and fresh vegetables, and maybe demographic disparities is always helpful, because these would be the core data that you would cite for the sense of urgency and where you need to put your resources.
And also right now we're in an environment where SNAP benefits have been cut across the board, and that is also contributing to our sense of urgency. So we've been looking at a lot of, state level internal data about how much SNAP is actually getting distributed and spent now. And just last month, it was 40% lower than February.
Oh my goodness, that's a lot of percentage lower.
It's, yes, very alarming.
Yeah. Okay, so then these would be the main data points that you'd put at the top of your impact statement. You'd have this list of resources. And then you would make that three, let's see if I can, you'd make three things like this, right? So here you would have the SNAP, here you would have the food system coordination, and here you'd have the advocacy.
Mm-hmm.
And you'd list your programs and activities, you would cite your things here, you have your resources, you'd articulate your productivity and your impact. These aren't things that you measure typically, but they're the things that are really nice to show the researchers that there's sustainability, right? So it's nice to be able to cite your impact and your long-term change and even your community level impact. And then this is where you'll put that data and you'll number your citations and link them.
Wow, I actually feel like I could make this map now. This was so helpful.
Oh, I'm so glad. That's the
You know,
goal.
I've made a lot of logic models in my life, and this is so much more, I guess it's just like easier to sort of understand and visualize in this method.
Oh, I'm really, really glad because yeah, the goal is to have something that really leads you to not just sort of tell the funder what it is that you're doing, but to actually be able to identify the data points you want to collect and how you're going to actually tell that story. It's just like, it's a map.
Yeah, I love it.
Great.
I actually, do you want to stop the record or?
Yeah.